Ich lese the work of many hands, writing the Declaration of Independence, written by Becky Gold and illustrated by Ron Himler. Und zwar, ja, das lese ich jetzt, weil am Dienstag der Independence Day ist. Und ich habe dieses Buch, das ist ein McGraw-Hill Reading, gefunden in the bookbox. The Road to Independence. Every year on July 4th, you probably do something to celebrate Independence Day. People sometimes call this holiday our country's birthday. What exactly are we celebrating? Well, it's the American Independence Day. More than 150 years before the Declaration was signed, Great Britain began sending settlers to North America. They lived in small settlements along the Atlantic shoreline, from Maine to Georgia. The settlements grew over time, and by 1732, there were 13 colonies in all. Their names are very familiar since the colonies later became states. That's Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Maryland, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New York. For a long time, the colonies had managed on their own. Each colony had its own government, post offices, schools, and businesses. The government in Britain still created the laws from far across the ocean. It was out of touch with the needs of the colonies. The colonists had little opportunity to make their voices heard. So in the 1750s and 1760s, Britain fought the 7 Years' War with France. Fighting wars is expensive. When this one ended, Britain needed to raise money, so its government made the colonists pay very heavy taxes. This angered the colonists, and they protested. Tea was one of the most heavily taxed items. One night in December of 1773, colonists from the Massachusetts colony, dressed as Native Americans, went to the Boston wharf. They sneaked onto the tea trading ships and dumped 342 cartons of tea into Boston Harbor. It was their way of letting King George III of Britain know how much they hated the tax. This protest is known as the Boston Tea Party. Other laws also angered the colonists. For instance, they had to let British soldiers, from whom they called redcoats because of their bright uniforms, stay in their houses. Most colonists admitted that they were proud to be part of Britain, the strongest nation on earth at that time. They did not all want to break away from their country, but they did want to set their own laws and raise their own taxes. See, and the bird is coming again. In the past, the 13 colonies had been separate, but now they had a reason to unite. Their leaders agreed to have a meeting in Philadelphia in September 1774. At this meeting, the First Continental Congress representatives came to speak for each of the colonies. These men voiced their complaints about Britain and came to two important decisions. The first one, the colonies should stop buying British goods. And the second one, they should be able to have their own armies to defend themselves. For a while, Britain eased up on the colonies. 7 months later, in April 1775, however, it found another reason to crack down on them. General Gage of the British Army had heard that colonists had a supply of ammunition in Concord, Massachusetts. He ordered redcoats to seize the arms and arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock, the leaders of these patriots. In the middle of the night, two patriots, Paul Revere and William Dawes, rode from Boston to Concord and warned colonists that British troops were coming. Displaying great courage, armed patriots met the redcoats near Lexington Green. Shots were fired. The first battle of the American Revolution began. And on page 5 is the Second Continental Congress. After the fighting broke out, tension with Great Britain increased. In the summer of 1775, another meeting, now known as the Second Continental Congress, was called. 54 representatives from the 13 colonies met once again in Philadelphia. Some of the representatives did not want the colonies to declare war. The battle near Boston were small. The battles, there were several. The colonies did not even have real armies. Ordinary men and boys fought the redcoats as best as they could. The representatives were sure that these untrained Minutemen, so-called, because they needed to be ready to fight at a minute's notice, could never stand up against the powerful British army. One representative, John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, was dead set against the war. He was a wealthy farmer and lived far from the battles of Boston, and Dickinson wanted the colonies to resolve their problems with Britain, while he believed that someday the colonies should be free. He did not want that day to come soon. One of Pennsylvania's other representatives at the Second Continental Congress was 70-year-old Benjamin Franklin. He was a brilliant thinker whose invention and writings still influence people to this day. Franklin felt strongly that America should be independent from Britain. He was not afraid to argue his view with Dickinson. Franklin was not alone in his opinions. John Adams was a lawyer and politician from Massachusetts. Of all the members on the Continental Congress, he felt most strongly that the colonies must break all ties with the mother country and do it soon. Strolling about the meeting hall, Adams tried to convince the other representatives that this was true. He stood up and gave passionate speeches about it. Sometimes the other members of Congress found his persistence annoying, but his determination helped change the minds of many who were still undecided about what course of action to take. Adams once said of another representative, Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, "During the whole time I sat with him in Congress, I never heard him utter 3 sentences together." Even so, he was shy and spoke little. Jefferson made his voice heard loudly through his writing. His ideas had a great impact on the future of the colonies. At 33 years old, Jefferson was one of the younger representatives. Among his many talents, he was a lawyer, a scientist, an architect, a doctor, and an inventor. He was also thought to be a brilliant writer, like many representatives. He was a wealthy farmer who owned slaves. The Congress continued its meetings for a full year. By the spring of 1776, battles began between the Patriots and the Redcoats had taken place in several colonies. War had still not been officially declared, but there was no longer doubt in anyone's mind that the colonies were in rebellion. General George Washington was head of the Continental Army. He often came to the Congress to give reports about how the war was going. Often his news was not very good. The war was expanding, and he still did not have enough trained soldiers. The Minutemen did not have the proper clothing or enough food or firearms. Washington asked the Congress to help him get more supplies from the colonies. The Congress, however, did not have the power to tell the colonies what to do. Even so, the debating was brisk. The representatives found it hard to come to an agreement. Was the war a way for the colonies to gain more rights as part of Britain, or was its purpose to break away completely? So in January of 1776, a man named Thomas Paine, what a name, helped make up many representatives' minds. He published a booklet called Common Sense. It laid out in very plain, clear words how it was just common sense for the colonies to become independent. Paine's notion caught on like wildfire. It also helped Virginia's leaders to decide that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. On June 7th, a representative from Virginia, Richard Henry Lee, asked that the Congress vote on this measure. Okay, and on page 10, we told these truths. Representatives argued for days about how to vote. Those from Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Virginia, and Georgia were in favor of independence. Delaware, New York, New Jersey, North Carolina, and South Carolina would not vote in favor of independence. Pennsylvania was still split between Benjamin Franklin and John Dickinson. The Congress decided to put off further arguments until July 1st. In the meantime, a committee would be formed to write a draft of a Declaration of Independence. This document would explain the reasons for becoming free from British rule. John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and Robert Livingston of New York were elected to the committee. John Adams proposed that Thomas Jefferson be the one to craft the words of the Declaration. At first, Jefferson didn't want the job. He argued that Adams should do it, but Adams refused. Here is what he said to Jefferson. Reason first, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian should be at the head of this business. Reason second, I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise. Reason third, you can write 10 times better than I can. So Jefferson could not make an argument against that. For days, Jefferson stayed up late into the night in his rooming house and worked on the first draft of the Declaration. He wanted to put down the ideas of the Congress in a way that all Americans would understand. Finding just the right words meant that he was always scratching some out and replacing them. The main idea he wanted to express was that the government was not meant to rule people, but to serve them. Jefferson wanted to prove that the colonies were justified to break free from British rule. So, und diesen Satz muss ich noch mal lesen. The main idea Jefferson, wanted to express was that government was not meant to rule people, but to serve them. There we are. Okay, and then page 12, there's a few more pages. The second sentence in the Declaration is its most famous. We hold this truth to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Okay. This is on page 12 in this one, and that was the second rule in the Declaration of Independence. What Jefferson was saying is that it is evident or obvious that all people deserve the same rights. In this time, this was a new idea. No one had dared to think they had the same rights as a king. Jefferson wrote his declaration in 3 parts. The first part told why the colonies thought they should be free. The second part told how Britain had ruled unfairly. And the third and last part actually declared independence from Britain. The declaration also introduced the idea of the United States of America for the first time. Before the declaration, no one called our country by that name. Yeah. When Jefferson presented his rough draft of the declaration to the members of the committee, they were impressed with his work. They made some corrections, and Jefferson himself saw that there were places where improvements could be made. He did a second draft, which was then presented to the entire Congress. However, the Congress had not yet voted for independence. That had to happen before any declaration could be printed. On July 1st, the Congress met to take up the matter once again. Almost everyone had come to an agreement. New York, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and Delaware were still split. By the next day, however, everyone except John Dickinson was in agreement. So Dickinson left Congress and enlisted in the Continental Army. Everyone else voted yes for independence. On page 14, now the Congress had a chance to respond to the declaration. They had many more chances to make changes, changes to make. They had many more changes to make. This time, Jefferson was very unhappy. He thought that the wording was just right. One of the problems had to do with slavery. Jefferson had blamed the king for enslaving Africans and bringing them to the colonies, even so he was a slave owner himself. Most Southern representatives did not feel as he did, however. They wanted no mention of slavery in a statement about independence. Reluctantly, Jefferson agreed to remove these lines. At last, the document with all its scrawled changes went to a printer, John Dunlap. A copy was also hand-lettered on parchment paper, and this one was signed by nearly all the representatives. A few who had voted for the independence chose not to sign it. The date on the declaration was July 4th, 1776. The following July 4th was the country's first celebration of Independence Day. So that was 1777. So, and there's an epilogue on page 16, words that launched the country, or a country, like the United States of America. The colonists did not become a country with the stroke of a pen. The war with Britain lasted 5 more years. It was 11 years before a constitution, the one we use today, was written. Today, there's often a large crowd around one particular case in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. The ink is now faded, and the large sheet of parchment paper has turned yellow, of course, but it is one of the most treasured documents we have preserved. It is the handwritten copy of the Declaration of Independence that was signed on July 4th, 1776. People all over the world have looked to the elegantly worded declaration. It inspired Spanish colonists in Mexico and South America to rebel against Spain. It encouraged French citizens in 1789 to overthrow their king and found a democracy. And now in Paris, shops are burning. And we have, today is July 1st in the year of 2023. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and many others who served in the Continental Congress became famous as founding fathers. I'm just thinking, why was there no woman? Many compromises went into this document, yet in stating the basic ideas on which our country is based, it holds as much meaning for us as it did for the colonists in the year 1776. And on the last page, there is a few questions. Yeah, this is story questions and activities because it's a school book. Okay, that's it. I'm ending the recording on Zoom. I'm Silvia Maria Feischl, the baby holder.